I'd like to share with you some stories about some people and places and experiences that I've had that have influenced the way that I think about nature, humanity, and technology. I've always been fascinated by the places where the natural world and human beings and the things that we create tend to blend together. And I grew up in such a place, about an hour north of Seattle, in a community called Conway on 7 acres of land. My parents moved there in the early 70s when I was a toddler, and our property was really an embarrassment of riches. We had a big field, we had 2 ponds, berries and fruit trees and a vegetable garden, and we had woods that extended for many more acres beyond our property, just right outside my back door. And I spent a lot of time in the woods as a kid, and usually what I would do would be run around with sticks and hit things and make forts and just go crazy out there. But as a teenager, I found that I still needed to go into the woods, but I had a different relationship with it. And what I would do is I would just find a quiet spot somewhere where I could clear my head. And I didn't think of it this way at the time, but later I came to understand that this perhaps was a form of meditation. And through that meditation, I felt a deepening relationship with the forest, and through that relationship, I started to feel a sense of responsibility for it. Now, elsewhere on our property was a different story. The previous owners of our house had used the larger of our 2 ponds as a garbage dump for a couple decades. And whenever they had a piece of household trash or an appliance they needed to get rid of, they would simply walk over to this hill and just pitch it down toward the pond. And over the years, this stuff had accumulated. And by the time my family moved there, there was a layer of sticker bushes and moss and weeds that had grown up over all this stuff. And my dad spent the better part of 2 decades clearing this and hauling it to the dump and getting the property in sort of beautiful shape. And it was also where I found myself playing a lot, and I became something of an amateur archaeologist. And so I'd go down to this place and I'd start unearthing things, old bleach bottles or pieces of dairy farm equipment, the rusty whorls of a box spring mattress. And one time I even found the hood of a BMW right down there. So all this crazy stuff that I would take with me and haul across our field to this refrigerated train car that had landed on the property somehow. And this is where we kept, this is the place we kept hay for our sheep. And there I made up little stories and explanations for what this stuff did and where it had come from and what it was about. And I came to understand something sort of implicitly about this environment, was that this was a place where the products of human civilization came to decay, where things were encrusted in rust, and these machines and parts were being returned to nature. Now, when I wasn't playing outside, I spent a lot of time in my dad's office. My dad's a civil engineer, and he would take me in on the weekends sometimes when he would go in to do a little extra work and plant me in a corner somewhere with a pad of paper that he had created by stapling together cut up blueprints. So I grew up drawing and writing stories on the backs of blueprint paper. My dad's office was divided roughly into quadrants, and in one part of the office was where the engineers worked with their desks and calculators and file cabinets and rubber stamps. And on the other side of the wall were the draftsmen, the guys with the big drafting tables and the elaborate drawing equipment, the really, really fancy pencils. And then behind them was a room where they kept the surveying equipment, this sort of mud-encrusted gear that these burly surveyors would haul out in the pouring rain in order to stand on a street corner somewhere for an afternoon holding a stick, right? So that was my understanding of what a surveyor did when I was a kid. And what I found about this place, which was also where I encountered the first computers, the early HP engineering computers, early digital computers, was that this was a place where human ingenuity and thinking interfaced with the earth. So human thought went toward creating technologies and drawing boundaries and figuring out where civilization was going to go on our planet. Now, around this time, I also started to understand or get an inkling of what technology was. And I was flipping through a magazine one day, and I came across an illustration of Lewis Carroll's Alice. and her body was composed of gears and circuits and wires, and the caption said, "Alice in Technology Land." And I asked my mother what this meant, and I don't remember her precise response, but I remember this profound feeling coming over me that this was a concept that I would need to return to again and again over the course of my life. Now, if I were to choose one anecdote that would illustrate how my mother influenced the way I think about things, it would have to be about the time I came home from school in 6th grade, and I'd been picked on that day by some bully. And as I told my mom this story about what had happened to me, she asked me a question. I'd expected to be sort of comforted, but at the end of this story, she said, "Well, are this kid's parents nice to him?" And the question really gave me pause, and I started to really think more about the underlying reasons behind human behavior and why it is we do the things we do to each other, which was a really great gift to give someone who was at that time sort of developing this idea that he wanted to become a writer. Now, my mother's father, who I called Poppy, was a war hero, a veteran of World War II, Korea, and Vietnam, recipient of the Distinguished Service Cross, who had never stopped asking really big questions. And whenever we would visit Poppy, usually in Florida, he would ask me some of these big questions. And invariably, there would come a time when, during our visit, he would corner me with a video camera and say such things as, "What is your generation planning to do regarding strategic defense?" or "What do you think of totalitarianism as a form of government?" Or "What is your opinion on mutual assured destruction?" Right? And I was 9, right? I was 9 years old or 8 when these questions started getting fired at me. And what I came to really appreciate about my grandfather was that while his war buddies were content to perfect their swing on the 9th hole, he never stopped thinking of these huge civilization-wide questions and really imparting those on me. Now, my other grandfather really, in some respects, couldn't have been more different. He was a visual artist who grew up and lived in the Midwest. And whenever we would visit Gramps, I would sit on his lap in the living room, and he would pull out this pad of drawing paper, and we would draw together. So, I would ask him to draw a dog, and so he would start sketching something, and suddenly it would cohere into a dog. And then he would ask me to draw a house, and I would draw it next to his drawing. And then sometimes he would take my hand and guide it across the page. And what was really miraculous to me was that there was a moment that I came to totally love when seemingly random lines suddenly made sense in a drawing. And I could see it. And I just became so fascinated by that process. And later, when I was a teenager, my grandfather told me about the plot of a science fiction novel he'd written as a young man and never published. And this was all the further encouragement I needed to keep pursuing this thing that I loved, which was writing stories. Now, these are the sort of influences that were swirling around me throughout my childhood. And what did I really take from them? Well, I learned to think about technology as it's directly in contact with the natural world. I started to ask questions about why it is we do the things we do when we're interacting with each other. What's the subtext? I started to ask really big questions and think in big terms about our place in history and our place within the development of civilization. And I also came to love and appreciate the miracle of art coming into being. And these were the influences I took with me to college. So I went to college at the Evergreen State College in Olympia, Washington, in the grunge years, in the early 90s. And there I found that our certain assumptions about nature, humanity, and technology had been sort of codified into certain philosophies and codes. So, for instance, I found at the time that environmentalism, to me, seemed to have divided us into these sort of polar camps. And on one side were people like the climate change deniers who scoffed at science. And on the other were those who believed that human beings were the worst thing that had ever happened to pristine planet Earth, and with a lot of gray area in between being argued. At the time, identity politics was also at full boil, with the idea that human beings were to be divided according to certain ethnic, racial, socioeconomic, gender categories. in order to conduct an elaborate calculus of privilege and victimhood. And this was also a time during the sort of do-it-yourself movement, right? So, and the way I would typify the do-it-yourself movement is that the word corporate became something of an epithet within my milieu, right? In fact, one time I was having a conversation with a guy about dumpster diving, right? Is everyone familiar with dumpster diving? It's where you go behind a business and open their dumpster and see if you can find any treasures there, right? And this guy that I was having a conversation with at one point said, "Dude, dumpster diving is just so corporate." And so this was also, the era of the beginning of the World Wide Web, and all the enthusiasm that went along with that, and all the sort of pie-in-the-sky ideas we had about what would come about, right? So we were convinced that soon we'd be uploading our brains into machines. We'd be buying everything we needed off our television sets, and we'd still be using CD-ROMs. There's also a lot of talk at the time about smart drugs. Does anyone remember smart drugs? Well, okay, smart drugs is basically an early 90s term for Jamba Juice boost, right? So as if on a surveyor's map, these boundaries were being drawn around nature and humanity and technology and what we thought of them. And I never really felt comfortable taking sides in these arguments so much. I didn't feel like I was entirely urban or rural. I didn't feel like I was aligned with technology or nature. And I was really interested in this sort of demilitarized zone between these categories where things started to bleed together. So after college, I started pursuing my Master of Fine Arts degree in creative writing, basically trying to understand human motivations and the subtext behind our behavior through literature. And my girlfriend at the time, now wife, was studying naturopathic medicine. And those of you who've ever lived with a medical student well know, when you live with a medical student, you tend to become a guinea pig, right? So in my case, being a naturopathic guinea pig involved such things as craniosacral realignment, acupuncture, a blood draw that took maybe 10, 11 attempts to draw any blood. Not my wife, actually, who did that. It was another student. And the ingestion of tinctures that appeared to be composed of twigs that had been gathered from the forest, and something called the wet sheet wrap. Now, the wet sheet wrap is where you take a really, really hot shower for about 45 minutes, and then you jump out and are swaddled in bed sheets that have been soaking in ice water, right? So despite these naturopathic treatments, I came to appreciate something about naturopathic medicine, which is that it's essentially an argument that human beings are of the earth and its systems and aren't to be considered simply a series of ailments to be treated in an isolated manner. Now, so these were the influences that were swirling around me as I started thinking more about my place in nature and my place in the world that was becoming increasingly technological. And so what did I really learn from these experiences? Well, one of the things I learned was that I came to see myself as someone who was responsible for imagining things, right? I wasn't as interested in predicting the future as I was in imagining it. And I guess the difference for me was that I came to feel that those who are interested in predicting the future oftentimes seem to be interested in cashing in on it. Whereas those who try to imagine the future seem to play a part in creating it. And so what do I imagine for the future? One of the things that I wish I could say was that I wish my imagination could always take me to a really happy place where I imagined that human ingenuity would deliver us from all sorts of problems, that we would overcome the crises of a hotter, more toxic, and more heavily armed world. And my sense of hope can lead me there, but oftentimes my imagination leads me to darker places. And at the same time, what I imagine is that that the world that we're living in, that all that we need in order to ensure the continued presence of life on Earth is within our grasp. And through these crises, we'll find that these categories between nature and humanity and technology grow increasingly more blurry. And I imagine that someday we're going to stop using the term artificial when we talk about artificial intelligence. The more we interface and interact with the information technology that we're using to augment our brains. And I imagine that what's happening is that at some point in our civilization, nature, humanity, and technology will be considered one thing, and that thing will be considered Earth's greatest expression, and that what it's trying to express is that the Earth wants to replicate life itself beyond our star. Now, do I always believe these things that I imagine? Sometimes I do. But what I'm convinced of, the things that I truly believe in, is that our role, the human being's role, we're this weird midway point between rocks and hard drives, that it's our role to always be open to influence each other, to always participate in this conversation that we're having around our role in the sweep of human history and the machines we make and the world we inhabit and the beautiful places that we've found ourselves in. And never stop imagining. Imagine, imagine, imagine. Thank you.